There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
In the years following his return from his voyage on the Beagle, Charles settled into life as a naturalist. On all fronts, both personal and professional, things were looking up for Charles. He had the pleasure of being nominated to the Royal Society of London, a distinction that was only slightly overshadowed by his marriage to Emma Wedgwood only 5 days later. You can't ask for a much better week. The young couple didn't waste much time in starting a family either. Within 11 months, their family of 2 had grown to a family of 3 with the birth of their first child, William Erasmus, his middle name being a respectable nod to Charles's grandfather and the author of the Zoonomia. William was the first of 9 children that would grace the lives of Charles and Emma. With only 2 exceptions, most of the children would go on to live long lives, the longest surviving Darwin being his 5th son, Horace Darwin, who died in 1928. 3 years after the couple's marriage, Charles and Emma, with 2 children in tow, moved to a country house near Down in Kent. This house came to be called the Down House, and it was here that Darwin would live out the rest of his life. His days were spent poring over his notes and the specimens he had collected from his 5-year voyage on the Beagle. He would also take long walks to gather his thoughts, and he rarely left Down House unless he had to attend a meeting. He preferred to correspond with his peers via letters, and many of which survive to this day. Among his close friends was the famed geologist Charles Lyell.
I saw more of Lyell than of any other man, both before and after my marriage.
Lyell was the president of the Geological Society, and he also wrote a book which was to have a major influence on Darwin called The Principles of Geology.
His mind was characterized, as it appeared to me, by clearness, caution, sound judgment, and a good deal of originality. When I made any remark to him on geology, he never rested until he saw the whole case clearly, and often made me see it more clearly than I had done before.
It was Lyell who introduced Darwin to the concept of small changes over immense periods of time, which Lyell wrote about in his Principles of Geology. Although the concept was geologically focused, Darwin began to apply it to biology. His thoughts and notes, fueled by Lyell's ideas of changes over time, began to develop into a small sketch of a theory. This sketch, or 35-page treatment, marked the first time that Charles revealed the direction his thoughts were taking him. Those thoughts were that biological changes in organisms by natural means of selection. This was in 1842, and by 1844 his brief 35-page treatment had grown to 230 pages, and more was to come. So what was Darwin writing about? He was writing about transformations, slow transformations being driven by life's ability to adapt to its surroundings. If an organism's offspring were altered slightly in structure from that of their parent, and that modification was to provide a benefit to the organism's survival, then those new traits would be passed on to their offspring, accumulate enough modifications over generations, and there was a good chance that the resulting organism might bear little resemblance to its ancestor. If Charles had any hopes of making his views public, those hopes were set aside with the publication of a book in 1844 called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. At first, the author was unknown. The book was published anonymously, and when one was to read it, they could see why. The book advocated the idea that life, all life, was the result of the transformation of species over time. Sound familiar? Well, it should. This wasn't exactly a new idea. Darwin's grandfather had proposed something similar in the Zoonomia, but the author of this book, who was later revealed to be a Scottish journalist by the name of Robert Chambers, took it further by adding what he claimed to be evidence of these changes. What Chambers suggested was that everything in the universe, everything, developed from earlier forms. The universe beget planets, the planets beget rocks, and the rocks eventually beget life. Life popped into existence spontaneously as well, according to Chambers. He claimed that experiments with electricity had spontaneously and inexplicably produced flies. According to Chambers, the universe's many changes were focused on the production of one particular species, that being man. Chambers noted that the fossil record, which was extremely thin at the time, pointed to many design flaws and instances of extinction. If a supreme being had personally created these flawed creatures, then why is it that they would not be walking or scurrying among his fellow Victorians? Why couldn't one go to the London Zoo to see a woolly mammoth? It was because, Chambers claimed, that the creator set everything in motion and then sat back to watch. Much like a child with a wind-up toy. He wound it up, set the universe down, and watched it go about its many bumps, stops, and starts. One couldn't blame an organism's flaws on the creator, for he never interfered. It goes without saying, but one can logically draw the conclusion that you can't give the creator credit for the successes either, unless of course you were of the thought that the point of it all was the ultimate creation of mankind. Either way, the words that Chambers wrote contradicted the scripture, which he went so far as to say were based on a corrupt and childish theology. Not very popular words. The backlash against this book must have caused Darwin to rethink making his own ideas public, at least for the time being while he developed them further. What he was missing was a mechanism for the changes he felt were obvious and evidential. So, for the next few years, he would turn his attention to barnacles. As would anyone who studies barnacles day in and day out, Darwin became sufficiently sick of looking at them. He therefore moved on to a slightly more interesting animal, the domestic rock pigeon. This was more up his alley, for English breeders had been artificially selecting rock pigeons for years, and this process had shaped the pigeons into many different forms. Darwin wondered if man could do this to a species of bird in only a few short years, imagine what nature could do in millions or even billions of years. The resulting species would be virtually unrecognizable from the original after a span of time, such as millions or billions of years. Darwin dove into his study of pigeons much like he had with his barnacles, exhaustively. He consulted with breeders and he even bred his own, becoming somewhat of an expert. If he had decided to turn his back on his theory about evolution and decided instead to raise pigeons, he could have easily done so. Lucky for us he didn't, but one has to wonder if his desire to fully immerse himself in his work wasn't a sort of coping mechanism for some of life's tragedies. In 1848, his father passed away, and 2 years after that, in 1850, tragedy struck again in a most appalling way. His daughter Annie lost her battle with consumption, a popular term at the time for tuberculosis. Her loss was one that he never fully recovered from. Annie was only 10 years old and was, it has been said, Darwin's favorite child. Whether or not this is true is beside the point. What can be said is that it is around this time that Darwin's own health began to suffer from chronic stomach problems. This would afflict him for pretty much the rest of his life, and it may be attributed to anxiety, not only due to the personal tragedy of losing one's child, but also, one could say in no small part, to the secrets of nature that he was uncovering. He knew how unpopular his developing theory was going to be. He was having trouble with it himself. As if pigeons weren't enough to keep him glued to his studies, he also brought plants into the fold. One thing that had troubled him with the vast variety of island plant species he saw in the Galapagos was how they managed to spread from island to island. Perhaps they were carried by birds, but that was highly speculative and not quite realistic. What made more sense was if they floated from island to island, but that would require days, if not months, exposed to the elements and not to mention exposed to the seawater. So to test this, Darwin would submerge seeds in seawater for weeks to see if they would survive a possible oceanic journey. They could. It was a remarkable discovery, and this observation joined the rest in his notebooks. It is possible, and entirely probable, that he could have continued on in this way for many more years, testing his hypothesis and filling his notebooks and breeding pigeons. In fact, one would think that he was in no rush to publish his book. In all reality, he wasn't. Not only did he want to be sure, he also knew that a possible backlash was in store for him when he did. He still remembered what happened when Robert Chambers published his own work. The book had made a small splash, but the resulting wave of contempt had doused its author. All because he had put forth the notion that life had evolved. Chambers even allowed for God's help, at least in jump-starting the process. He even placed man at the top of the process. But Darwin's theory made no such concessions. He knew this, and he was reluctant to let others know this. Life, however, has a way of thwarting the plans of mice and men, even men such as Charles Darwin. Whether he liked it or not, his views were about to find themselves on the world's stage. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material and ways to support the show at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to hear from you. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.